Esther chapter 1, Esther in the Old Testament. And, Esther is one of the most action-packed books, I believe, in the whole Bible. One of the most intense, one of the most dramatic books, one of the most dramatic stories that you could read, not only in the Bible, but probably in any kind of story. Yesterday I just heard about this woman who's written a play on the story of Esther. It's just a very dramatic. I mean, it's just created for drama and for TV and for movies and for plays and all those kinds of things. And so I just want to quickly go through this morning in the time that we have remaining. And this basically happens in the land of Persia, and it's actually a vast kingdom. And it's very interesting. India is only mentioned twice in the Bible, and both of the times are here in the book of Esther. Okay, and in fact, it's mentioned in the very first verse. If you look at Esther chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush." And this is a vast kingdom. The kingdom of Persia extends from India, and I did a little bit of research on this, and it's basically the western part of Punjab, the northern tip of Gujarat, and basically all of Pakistan, and beyond, all the way to Egypt, and beyond that side also. That was all the kingdom of Persia. And in fact, something interesting, as I was sitting here just this morning, the thought came to me, my nani was a Parsi. Okay, she was a Parsi, and she is no more. But my mom's mom was a Parsi, and I was just thinking, what is the relation of this? And I said, I'm actually 1/4 Persian. Very interesting. Maybe I'm a descendant of King Xerxes. I would love to think that, And when the Parsis, what we know as the Parsis, they were in Persia, which is now Iran, right? When the Arabs took over Iran, then they came to India. There's a very close relationship between the Persians and the Persian kingdom, and now Parsis, of course, and India, right? They were part of the kingdom at that time. There's this great king, Xerxes, who rules over the whole kingdom, one of the most powerful men who's ever lived in the history of the world, right? This is around 480 BC or so, about 2,500 years ago. And so this great king Xerxes of Persia, he holds this massive festival, you could say, or party, and it lasts for 180 days. Okay, a whole 6 months of festivities, and people come from all the 127 provinces, including India, I'm sure, at that time, to be a part of this. And at the very end of the festival, he has one great banquet for all of his princes and all of the nobles and all the great people from all of his entire kingdom. He holds this huge banquet for them. And once, everybody's eaten and drank and everybody's having a great time, he says, "Bring out my queen." And her name is Vashti, Queen Vashti. And I just want to, basically, show her off, because she is so beautiful. And so the word goes to Queen Vashti. The king has summoned you to come out and maybe to dance or whatever it is for all of his noblemen and all of the other people, great people from the kingdom. And she says, "I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of him treating me like an object." He says, "I'm not coming out." And this is, of course, a great embarrassment for King Xerxes, tremendously powerful man. And he calls all of his advisors and counselors together and says, "How can the queen do this?" And it's also very interesting if you read the story that, one of the main concerns is if other women in the kingdom hear about this, they'll also start disobeying their husbands. That we need to do something about this. What should we do? And they all discuss. And they say, okay, what we need to do is Get rid of her. Okay, she's gone. Now we need a new queen. How do you find a queen? And I say, okay, well, so the idea comes, why don't we get all the beautiful young virgins in the whole kingdom, and we'll give them months and months of treatments of beauty and, all this kind of stuff. And then, King, everybody will be paraded, and you'll get to spend time with each of these beautiful young women, and you can decide who you'd like to be with. So that's what they do. And they go through this long process that lasts months and months, and finally the king chooses and falls in love with this young girl named Esther. It so happens that Esther is a Jew. Okay, she's one of God's people. And not only is she a Jew, but she's also an orphan. She's a young, beautiful orphan girl. Her mother and father have died. She's been raised by her older cousin named Mordecai. And Esther is chosen to be Xerxes' queen. So she goes from being an orphan girl to being the queen of the most powerful man in the world. Maybe just as a teenager. And it so happens that the right-hand man of the king is a man named Haman. And Haman is a very proud man. He loves to be honored by the king and all the people. He loves it when he goes out into the city that people should stand up and honor him and respect him. And everybody does that because he's known as the right-hand man of the king. But there's one man who refuses to stand up and honor another man like this. Who is that man that refuses to honor Haman? It's Mordecai. Esther's basically her father, right? He sits at the king's gates day after day, and he doesn't stand up when Haman goes out, and Haman burns with anger. He said, how dare everybody's standing up for me, and I love it. I love the power, I love the glory, I love the respect and the honor, but this man, and as long as he's sitting there, I don't get any joy out of all the good things I have in my life and all the privilege and all the position, as long as this guy still sits when I come out. His anger burns against not just Mordecai, but he finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, God's people. And he says, I'm not going to just get Mordecai killed, I'm going to kill all of the Jews. And he goes to the king, he convinces the king, these people are bad people, we need to get rid of them. They're anti-national. And so they set a date, and the king agrees to it because he doesn't really care. And he says a date that on this day, all the Jews are going to be killed. Anybody, you can just kill your Jew if they're a neighbor, right? Whoever they are, just kill them. Take their stuff. And so this is a source of great grief, of course, for the Jews. And so now let's pick up the story in Esther chapter 4. Okay, turn over to Esther chapter 4. And we'll start in verse 1. Esther chapter 4, verse 1. It says, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only so far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and the order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Verse 9, Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Okay, let me just stop there for a second. So Mordecai sends word to Esther. This is what's happening. Apparently, she may not even know. And Esther says, okay, but what am I supposed to do? He says, you need to go to the king, Mordecai says. And Esther says, but don't you realize there's one law? No one can come in front of the king unless the king has asked them, unless the king has summoned them. And if you go in front of the king without being summoned, you'll be dead. That's the king's law. Unless, in some amazing chance, the king reaches out his scepter and basically invites you in and welcomes you. And Esther said, maybe you don't realize how things work in the palace here, but I know very well. And we all know what happened to the previous queen. Okay, verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Do you hear what Mordecai is saying? He says, I know how things work. But this particular moment is bigger. And I don't know if you notice what he says here. He says, if you don't do something right now, God will save the Jews. God is not going to allow his people to perish like this because of one proud man named Haman. Right? He's got this incredible confidence. God will save our people. But then he says, did you see this in verse 14 again? For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. He's saying, Esther, if you stay quiet and save yourself, God is going to save the Jews. You're the one who's going to perish. So that's counterintuitive. It's the Jews who are going to perish, but she's in the queen, in the palace. She's the one who's going to be saved. That's what she's thinking. Mordecai actually turns it around. God is going to save his people. You're the one who's going to perish. Well, how is Esther going to perish? I think basically what he's saying is, if you stay quiet at this time, in such a crisis situation, it's over for you. That basically means that you have betrayed your people. In other words, you've betrayed God. In other words, you are basically on the enemy's side. How in the world can God bless you in that condition? It's over for you. Mordecai is not so worried, interestingly, about the people. He has this incredible confidence God is going to save his people somehow. Esther, you're the one that's going to suffer. And then he finishes with this classic line at the end of verse 14. Did you see that? And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Who knows that it's all been leading up to this one moment? Maybe this is the reason that your parents died and you are so full of grief. And maybe this is the reason that I took you in and God orchestrated all those things. And maybe this is the reason that Vashti decided not to show up that day at the king's banquet. And maybe this is the reason that that the king decided to chuck her out. And maybe this is the reason that the king decided to find another queen. And maybe this is the reason that it was suggested to him that he should find a queen in this particular way. And maybe this is the reason that God made you beautiful. And maybe this is the reason that you are the right age when all this happened in the kingdom. And maybe this is the reason that the king liked you. And maybe this is the reason that the king selected you. And maybe this is the reason that even Haman had this idea to kill all the Jews. And maybe this is the reason that you're in the palace and we're all out here. It's all because of this one moment where this crisis is happening. Action needs to be taken. Somebody's got to risk their lives to save the whole nation, millions of people, and even God's plan for the whole world. Maybe it's all been leading up, everything that's happened, good and bad, to this very moment. Wow, that's a lot of pressure for a pretty young orphan girl. Okay, before we go to Esther's response, I just want to make a few quick points here, all right? Number one, some particular times are more important than other times. Isn't that what Mordecai is telling us here? Maybe all of those times that have happened, good and bad and ups and downs, has all been leading to this time, for such a time as this. Nobody planned it, nobody expected it, but could it be God has orchestrated everything for all these decades for this moment? And I think about that for our own lives and the way God works. Right? Some particular times are more important than other times. Right? It's not like life is just flat. And every day is important. Every moment is important in its own way. But God, the way God has worked and the way that life works is that some moments are more important than other moments. And we realize, maybe looking back, that things were leading up and building up and all these things were happening for this moment. And sometimes it's very obvious. We know it going into it, the day that I'm getting married, or the day that I'm having my first child, or I'm moving to a different city, or maybe even to a different country. Right? Sometimes it's something that I resolve. I need to do this, and maybe it's not a big thing for anybody else. They don't even know it's a big thing, but for you, it's a big thing. This is the day I'm resolving to say, leave this habit, or say no to this relationship, or to confront this person, or to speak the truth to my loved one that I've been hiding for all these years, right? Maybe that moment comes sometimes, right, totally unexpectedly, get into an accident, suddenly lose a loved one, suddenly lose my job. I'm the victim of some kind of terrible assault. Right? Sometimes that moment comes and goes and we don't even realize it at the moment. We only look back and say, oh my goodness, I actually stop and think about it. The fact that I showed up at that social gathering, it was just another party, it was just another wedding or whatever it was, but I started talking to someone and I ended up marrying them. Or that person ended up being my best friend, or I ended up getting a business contact or a job, and everything's changed, and now I'm living in a different place, and this and that, or whatever it is. Something very interesting to do sometime, if you've never done this before, is actually look back at your life and to draw a graph, like a line graph, the ups and downs of your life. I'm sure you'll find that there was maybe 5 or 6 or even 1 or 2 moments. They might have been high, they might have been low, right? But they were life-altering. Some particular moments are more important than other moments. And by the way, we see that in the Bible, right? David happens to be sent with bread and cheese or whatever it was to his brothers on the battlefield. And there he hears Goliath's words, and Joseph decides to resist Potiphar's wife. Ruth decides to cling to Naomi, if you know these stories. Saul decides to go to Damascus. Eve decides to eat the fruit. These defining moments. You look back and you realize it's all been leading up to that moment. Everything that's happened. Some particular times are more important than other times. The second thing I want to say about this is some particular times will never come back again. Hey, isn't that what Mordecai tells Esther? This is a do or die situation. The date has been set. The wheels are in motion. Our people are going to be killed in just a few days. You can decide to act, you can not decide to act. You might be saved, you might not be saved. All of us might be saved, all of us might not be saved, but something's going to happen. And even if you decide not to act, I think this is kind of implied in Mordecai's words, even if you decide not to act right now, that is a kind of action, isn't it? Even inaction is a kind of action because something's happening. Even if you are afraid or you don't know what to do or whatever it is, your inaction is a kind of action. This window, it's closing. We're never going to have this time. You act, you don't act, it's now. Some particular times are more important than other times. Some particular times will never come back again. And like I said already, some particular times are going to define our lives. Like it or not, good or bad, life is never going to be the same again after this. Whatever you do and whatever the outcome is. Life is, the trajectory of my life is going to change. Again, for the better, for the worse. This is never going to come back. And this is going to define us. This is going to shape us. This is going to alter us in some way or another. And that's the way God has decided it. Some particular time defines your life. That's what Mordecai tells Esther. Maybe it's all been leading up to this very moment. You're the queen. You're in the palace. The edict's been made. You're the only one in the whole world that can do something about this. Even if you decide you're too afraid or you just cannot do it for whatever reason, whatever happens, this is going to define our lives. It's going to shape the world in this case. Right? Maybe it's all happened for such a time as this. It's all been leading up to this one moment. What are you going to do? Okay, let's go back to the story. What does Esther decide? Verse 15 says, Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Wow. Esther realizes the gravity of the situation. Right? Esther understands, finally. She says, all right, this is the time. Right? It's not really about me or my position or my safety. Right? I've got to do it. If I perish, I perish. But I've got to do something. Right? And we don't have time, of course, to go through the rest of the story, but the way that it rolls out, Esther, after 3 days, she probably dresses up, takes a deep breath, enters into the king's room. The king extends his scepter, and through a course of various events, ends up becoming aware of what's happened. He ends up taking back the edict and the decree. God's people are saved. And through an even more amazing turn of events, Haman is executed, and Mordecai is raised to become the king's right-hand man. It's amazing how the story works out. In fact, it's awesome. You know, Esther is only one out of 2 books in the entire Bible that don't have the word God in it. The other one is Song of Solomon. The word God never appears in the book of Esther, and yet I would say Esther is one of the most God-centered, God-saturated books in the whole Bible. Right? You don't even have to use the word God because God is everywhere. Orchestrating, conducting, moving, pushing, pulling. And yet God uses people. And you know, another very interesting thing about this book, Esther is called Queen Esther 14 times in this book. 13 out of those 14 times are after this moment. Did you get that? Esther becomes Queen Esther, basically. Not just position-wise, she already had that, right? But now she's really a queen in the eyes of the people, in the eyes of history, in the eyes of God himself. She's not the poor little orphan girl anymore. She is Queen Esther. Okay, finally. What does this have to do with us? What does this have to do in the middle of a Building Hope series? Well, I think it's probably obvious. You know, it's very clear to me that God has put us in this situation as people, as a church, for such a time as this. And I really wish sometimes when I think about it that we had thought of this, 6, 7 years back. And we could have gotten the same land for a cheaper price and better land for much cheaper. But that thought never came into my mind. It literally never came into my mind. And nobody suggested it to me also. And you know why nobody suggested to me that idea? And you know why the thought never came to my mind? Because it wasn't the time yet. Right? Maybe we weren't ready. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe our church wasn't ready. God was waiting for such a time as this. But let me be very honest with you. When that thought had come into my mind, for whatever way, I think related to the parking and all that kind of stuff, and we did a little bit of investigation just to get the basic information of, whatever. Even before we went to the elders and talked to the other leaders in the church, I felt I was at a defining time in my life. Because if we're going to go into this project and raise crores and crores of rupees, and it's going to last for years, and I'm a pastor, and I don't want to get involved in land and construction and government and fundraising. But I said to myself, the thought of getting, a bigger land and thinking about the future and having a training center and a base where we can really plant other churches, actually, it's very exciting. And we need that and we should do that. But why am I so hesitant? I realize it's only because I'm afraid, literally. Because if we're going to do this, we have to go into it in a big way. Right? That's the only way it's going to happen. And if we go into it in a big way and it's a flop, then I'm going to be discouraged. We're all going to be discouraged. And before I even shared it with the other elders, it was almost like a life-defining moment for me. See, and then, to think that land prices have come down, and even since we started this project, that demonetization has come in, and GST has come in, and there's a slump in the market, and prices were overpriced, and now they've gone way down, and et cetera, et cetera. I think I said this last week. I think that God is doing all this for us. I actually believe that. Because he wants us to do something as for such a time as this. And this window is not going to last forever. As we close this morning, I just want us to think about your own life. Could it be that God brought you here to the city, not to be too overdramatic, right? But sometimes we need to see the drama in our lives, don't we? Right? Our lives are very dramatic. And God is weaving this incredible story of our lives with the story of the world and what he's doing. And could it be that God brought you to Gurgaon for such a time as this? It wasn't your job. It wasn't your company. Right? But that God's hand actually led you to Gurgaon, maybe kicking and screaming. And maybe it wasn't Google that led you to this church, but God's Spirit. And maybe this is the reason that for some of you, you're trying to get out of this place as quickly as you can, but all the doors are closing, and you're still here, and it's depressing, and maybe God has brought and left you here and kept you here for such a time as this. And for some of you, I know God has blessed you tremendously. Like Queen Esther, he brought you from poverty to a place of privilege and position and wealth that very few people have. Is it possible that he's done it for such a time as this? For me, the answer to those questions is very obvious. Right? A lot of people have come and gone in our church. A lot of things have happened and, whatever. But we're all now here in the church at this time. The project is happening. And there's no mistake. God is in control of everything. And I'm 100% sure that he wants to use us. And he's brought us to this point for such a time as this. And this time is not going to last forever. One last thing before we finish. Just coming back one more time to the book of Esther. Esther, God's plan for Esther was not just saving a few people at that time, as great as that was. God's plan was not just to save his people, it's to save the whole world. And not just from physical death, but from eternal death. And his plan came through his people. Jesus was going to come from the Jews. That was God's plan. And God has elevated this poor orphan girl, pretty young girl, to save his people. Right? It's all pointing ahead and leading towards Jesus. And it's very interesting. Esther was poor and she was elevated so she could save her people physically. Jesus was rich and became poor. Esther says If I perish, I perish, and God saved her and saved her people. Jesus says, if I perish, I perish, and God kills him. Right? He actually perishes. Right? Not just to save people physically, but to save his people eternally. It's all prefiguring and leading up even to a greater moment when Jesus is going to come and die for us and rise again for us. And now, in light of all of this, God has given us this incredible purpose, this incredible mission. And it's all being worked out for something eternal that he wants to do through us. Oh, I pray, God, don't allow us to squander this.